Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist, otherwise known as Hell's Unicorn, and this is the second installment of Debunking Hitler Myths. And this deals specifically with a website that I discovered a few days ago that asserted a viewpoint that Hitler was in fact a practicing Christian and a confessing Christian, a view that I differ on. Now, in the first myth, they dealt generally with the issue of whether or not Jesus was a Christian, and they made several arguments, which I went through point by point. The second section, titled Myth 2, is basically it's a response to the assertion that Hitler pretended his Christianity only for political purposes. Now, before I get into this, I just want to speak generally on the general thrust of this article. This article gets into a lot regarding the table talk, which was the primary source that I used for my first video on this topic. And essentially, this article takes a viewpoint of the table talk that is the same as that of atheist historian Richard Carrier, who argued that the English edition is actually a poor translation, and it was based on another poor translation by Francois Genaud, who translated the table talk from German into French. And that is the primary source for our current edition of the table talk. We don't have any of the German originals. And thus, Carrier makes the assertion that the French version, which was taken directly from the Bormann edition of the table talk, was touched up a bit by Bormann to make it have more of an atheistic leaning to it, which is where Bormann was coming from. Bormann being one of the elites in the Nazi Party and the personal secretary of Hitler. Now, the general idea that develops here is the fact that it was actually Bormann making these statements that Christianity was the enemy of Nazism and that Hitler basically was still a practicing Christian. Now, the problem with this is, first off, there are only a handful of historians, according to Wikipedia, that are making this claim, and there are other historians who maintain a very different view on this. They argue that Hitler made many statements regarding his beliefs, and they were anti-Christian in nature, and he gets into other conflicting public statements as well as private statements that lead him to this conclusion, ones which are glossed over by the Hitler Myths website completely. In fact, the Hitler Myths website, the actual citations, all come from atheist sources, and essentially there are only about 4 or 5 of them, and they all seem to be coming from the same general direction. Now, before I get into the specifics of the article itself, I just want to get back to the original definition of a Christian, because this is a point that I had hit upon on an earlier video. What makes a Christian? How do we qualify the definition of being a Christian? My assertion being is that we have to go to the scriptures to understand this, because this is our only infallible testimony of the beginning of the church, which was the Gospels, being the word of Christ, and then after that the Acts of the early church, the epistles, and so on. Now, according to the New Testament, basically, Christ is depicted as being the Son of God and being of a wholly human and a wholly divine nature. This is precisely what the Bible testifies him to be. Now, in contrast to this, with a study of Hitler's views, his political views as well as his theological views, generally his beliefs regarding the person of Christ, we get a very different picture than that. We don't get a view that Christ is a universal Savior that is to save all Christians. We don't get any of the supernatural concept of the resurrection of the body and how those who are saved by the grace of Christ are to come into full communion with God. Instead, we get Christ as a political Messiah. Ironically enough, Hitler's view of Christ is actually not all that different from the view that the Pharisees have of the Messiah that they were expecting. And that was a Messiah that would deliver one nation from the influence of another. Hitler took the view that Christ was in fact not descended of the bloodline of Abraham because, after all, he could not have been a Jew in Hitler's estimation because a Jew would not have rebelled against other Jews. This speaks specifically to Hitler's lack of understanding on the nature of the scriptures, and also Hitler's odd sort of nationalistic fervor, which very strongly clouded his thinking on the topic of religion in general. But suffice to say, if we qualify a Christian by Bible belief, we have very little to go on to suggest that Hitler was in fact one who believed in the revelation that is Christianity, the Word, so to speak. What we get instead is someone who maybe has a loose understanding of it and wishes to subordinate it under a political cause. And consequently, I can't, in good conscience, refer to Hitler as being a Christian, even in a mildly heretical sense, the way I would certain other denominations. And this is proved out also by the general cultural trends of Germany at the time. In addition to some links that deal specifically with the issues of the table talk, I've also provided a few regarding the religious state, the state of religion in Germany at the time that the Reich took control, the transition from the Weimar Republic into the Nazi German Empire, so to speak, the Third Reich. And there is a good amount of basically bad theology going around, liberal theology as it were, and this is what Hitler's views most conform to, and this is where his initial support came from. I've provided a link to an article that gets into the religious climate in Bavaria, which is where Hitler drew most of his early support, and I also have some general links to some other sites that also deal specifically with Hitler's hostility towards Orthodox Christianity, mainly the mainline Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic Church, the churches that conform more to the early church model than the liberal Christianity where Hitler enjoyed much of his early support and continued support after he assumed power. Now, getting into the specific article, there's only a few points that I want to hit because a lot of this is just basically brainless rambling. But to start off with, let's take a look at this particular sentence right here. Of course, Hitler did try to use political force to control Christianity, and he tried to establish a unified Reich Christian church. Now let's stop there. Instead of using the term in the previous article, unified Reich German church, now he puts the term Christian in. Now there's a problem with this. A Christian is defined by the belief that Christ is Lord, that he is the cornerstone that builds the church, which is God's church. How do you use political force in order to control the house of God if you're a Christian claiming to be under the rule and authority of that church? It doesn't make any sense at all. So stating that Hitler is a Christian doesn't hold up even here at the beginning. But moving on. But this only supports his stand on his view of positive Christianity as described in the Nazi Party platform. And yes, he criticized the Catholic and Protestant hierarchy, but so what? So do popes and Protestant leaders. Martin Luther himself strongly condemned the Catholic religion and thought of it as the work of the devil. Well, let me answer that for you. So what? Roman Catholicism and most mainline Protestant churches, although they are very different from each other, are much closer to the original church government that was established in the book of Acts immediately after Christ's ascension into heaven than any other church that's out there today, with the exception of the Eastern churches. So the fact that Hitler has found himself on the opposite side of Christianity as these churches speaks very strongly to the notion that Hitler was in fact a heretic and thus also an apostate. Moving on. I suspect that those who propagate this myth rely on mainly one source, the dubious reliability of Hitler's table talk, a second-hand source that allegedly records the words of Hitler. Most historians generally believe that most of the table talk is directly taken from Hitler and that the editing that went on is minimal. But even if we assume that it is an unreliable source, there are plenty of others. Moving on. What obliterates this theory comes from the fact that Hitler continued to express his positive Christian views well after his rise to power. If indeed he needed Christianity only for political purposes, then why oh why does he continue with the charade after he has established himself as absolute dictator? Well, let's answer that question right now. Even absolute dictators have to remain in the high esteem of their subjects, so to speak. What I mean is that even if you have absolute power, that power is contingent on the fact that those that you rule over believe that you are entitled to that power. What good is a king if everybody in his country wants to kill him? What good did Louis XVI's absolute power actually do him when the French Revolution occurred and he found his head in the guillotine? Even absolute dictators have to maintain some form of political viability within their nation. And so this is not really an argument that can state that Hitler had no reason whatsoever to continue in the facade that he was a Christian. On the contrary, there's plenty of reason, based on what I've just said, to assert that that is actually possible and indeed what probably happened. Moving on. The only evidence that we have or could ever have about people who call themselves Christian comes from the very confession of those making the claim. This is not necessarily the case, particularly if you go back to the Bible. If you look in the Gospels, when the disciples ask Christ, "How will we know those whom you are calling?" And he responds, "You will know them by their works." Yes, we must confess our faith. Yes, we must believe. But there is a necessary symptom of that belief, which we Augustinians refer to as sanctification. More specifically, the fact that our nature changes as we are brought into union with Christ, and as such, what we do, what we say, how we behave changes and conforms to the law as it is written in the Old Testament. Moving on. And since Hitler makes his claim to Christianity abundantly and clearly, we can only rely on his claim regardless of whether he actually believed in Christ or not. False Christianity has just as much validity as any claim to Christianity, even if you could prove dishonesty. Now this right here is where the whole thing basically falls apart. I don't know what kind of logical gymnastics you have to do to get yourself into making the claim that something is false, and therefore even if we can prove dishonesty, it is just as valid as something else that is true. The only thing that we can really take from this is the fact that this particular writer has no ability to make distinctions between something that conforms to original definition and one which doesn't. And this is basically the symptom of an atheistic bias and also of atheist stupidity. And finally, but regardless of how you view a person's claim to their religion, to say Hitler used Christianity only for political forces has absolutely no basis in history to back it up. To simply rely on belief or opinion says absolutely nothing about historical fact. Now, the majority of this article is opinion. But in terms of stating that belief or opinion says nothing about historical fact, the only thing that he relies on here primarily is Hitler's assertions, Hitler's belief that he is a Christian. And so really he's defeated his whole argument. And as I stated before, I am absolutely perplexed at how people can argue these points with a straight face, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Please take some time to visit the links that I've provided in the description, because they will elaborate on the points that I've made further. And with that, I will conclude, and we will come back to this next time. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. God be with you.